Hello everyone, in this video we are going to go over the Sprint 2 documents. So let's start off with the Sprint 2 planning meeting. After our initial meeting with Dr. Sajadi, these are the user stories we chose to work on for this sprint. First off is reviewing the project structure in the code, setting up our local development environments, researching the question system, creating a question bank view, create a placeholder named attendee, add a placeholder to invitation email templates, fix a connection to VIP, import data from VIP. And Manuel Diarmas chose to work on reviewing the project structure and code, setting up the local environment, researching the question system, and creating the question bank view. Pedro Ramos chose to create the placeholder for the attendees and add the placeholder to the invitation email templates. Carlos chose to work on the connection to VIP and importing data from the VIP website. So if we go to our daily Scrum meetings, you can see the progress we made. So on the first day of the sprint, most of us worked on setting up the local environments, and we had a lot of issues doing this. The second day, in Manuel's case, he was identifying the data models, the views, and controllers related to the questions, analyzing the code base, and trying to pull the code from the production servers and development to get our repository working. And at that point, the hurdles were that he wasn't able to access the development or production servers. In Carlos's case, he had installed his virtual machine for the local environment, but he was having some issues. He planned on studying and learning about Sencha and how to connect the applications to the VIP, and he had issues on the installation of the virtual machine. Pedro was very similar. He was researching the Sencha and using tutorials and other things. He wanted to finish setting up the local development environment, and he had issues making changes on his virtual machine. So most of the first week we had most of the same things. We continued analyzing the code that belonged to our goals. We also tried fixing the local development environment, but we kept having a lot of issues. As you can see, Carlos had to install a new one. He still had a lot of issues and conflicts. Pedro was also having trouble setting this up, and I had mine set up, and I was working on getting the code into the repository while identifying different components that belong to the question module. So on September 20th, I was able to push the production version of the code into our repository and create several branches for production, being the master branch and the development branch. Pedro was looking into the invitation templates, and he was cloning the production code into his local environment, and Carlos was identifying the issues that he had while installing his local development environment. On September 21st, I properly set up a repository. I created a branch for my user stories to begin development. I was planning on identifying the views to start working on the question bank view for the administrator, and I wanted to streamline the local development environment setup process. Pedro was creating his user stories, and he was learning about the invitation templates and placeholders, and Carlos was learning about the Sencha proxies and planned on looking into the previous versions of the app, which had a working version of the proxy to the VIP website. So starting in the second week of the Sprint 2, after a meeting with Dr. Sajadi, he recommended looking into Vagrant. So I started looking into Vagrant to streamline our build process. In Pedro's case, he was working on a new local development environment because he was having a lot of issues with certain dependencies and versions. And Carlos was also looking into making a new local development environment due to some issues he was having. On the 25th of September, Vagrant, um, I was finally able to install the Vagrant environment and configure it to run on Ubuntu 14.04, which is the current operating system that the production and development servers are running. I planned on getting the virtual machine working with all the dependencies that Mobile Judge needs to run correctly and smoothly. And my hurdles were learning the Vagrant system, how to utilize it properly, and set up the virtual machine. Pedro had to reinstall his virtual machine because of issues, and that was his goal. Carlos finally got access to Confluence, so he was analyzing the code and looking at the Confluence, and he was also doing a reinstallation of his virtual machine for his local development environment. On the 26th, I was able to configure the virtual machine via Vagrant and added most of the dependencies needed to run Mobile Judge. My goal for the next Scrum meeting was to finish the Vagrant machine with a running version of Mobile Judge. And some of my hurdles were getting the virtual machine to run Mobile Judge smoothly and creating an instance of PHPMyAdmin to import the database needed. Pedro was also working on setting up the virtual machine using Vagrant, and that was his goal. Carlos was also working on getting the local development environment working with Vagrant. On September 27th, I finally finished a fully functioning virtual machine running Mobile Judge smoothly. I was able to distribute the .box file, which contains the whole virtual machine with everything they need to just deploy a local development environment. My plan was to create a video that goes through the installation process via Vagrant, and my hurdles were having everybody set up the development environment correctly so we could all start developing. Pedro was setting up the development environment from the .box file. Carlos was also doing that, but he had issues with some components not working on his application. On the final day of our sprint, I was setting up all the documentation needed to properly set up the Mobile Judge development environment via Vagrant. Also, documentation for the usage of Git and general use of Vagrant. Pedro was looking at code that related to his invitation template and placeholder goals. And Carlos was able to get his virtual machine running with my help, and he began looking into the creation of the proxies and some of the reasons why they are now not working. So we go to our sprint 2 retro. The velocity was more or less the same, even though a lot of changes were made mid-sprint. So most of the original user stories we chose to work on did not get worked on because our focus changed from beginning development to streamlining the deployment of the local development process. Did we do a good job of estimating the points for each user story? No. Again, the user stories were changed mid-sprint so we could focus on the deployment of the local development environment. And also there's a note here that user stories will require more time than estimated due to having to go through the process of learning the code and the framework. Did each team work as scheduled? Pedro and Carlos were behind setting up the local development environment due to virtual machine errors. What went right? All team members were able to eventually have a fully functioning local development environment. Videos for the local development environment installation were created and shared with the professor, and the Vagrant box was successfully implemented, allowing for faster local development environment deployment. So some of the issues that we need to address next sprint is we should all focus on the parts of the code that we need to specifically work on to get our user stories completed, and we need to communicate more effectively and frequently. And some ways that we can improve the product is having a better understanding of the needs of each actor utilizing the system, and coming up with great new ideas and improvements to existing features. So in our sprint review, you can see most of the user stories that were originally in the planning document were moved to the backlog to be worked on in a future sprint. and we created some new ones mid-sprint, such as MJ35, which was the research of the Vagrant software, MJ37, which was creating a Vagrant box for the mobile judge, and mid-sprint, more towards the end, we had a bug that brought the development server down, so all those things needed to be addressed. But at the end of the day, we got 4 user stories done, which will greatly benefit future teams that'll have to set up their local development environments. So that wraps up Sprint 2. Thank you very much for listening, and have a great day.